Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. In the early hours of June 1st, 1902, a violent storm rolled across the Suffolk countryside. Rain struck the windows of Peacenhall, thunder shook the village, and most people stayed behind locked doors. But inside a building called Providence House, something terrible happened. By morning, 22-year-old Rose Harsent was dead at the foot of a staircase. Nearby lay signs of fire, a broken bottle, and the remains of a secret meeting that may never have taken place as planned. Peacenhall was the kind of place where people generally knew one another's routines. It was a small rural community, surrounded by fields and connected by narrow roads. Local life revolved around work, family, and chapel. Privacy was possible, of course, but secrecy was more difficult. A whispered accusation could travel quickly. A friendship noticed at the wrong moment could become village gossip. And once suspicion settled on someone, it could be almost impossible to remove. Rose Harsent worked as a domestic servant. She was young, unmarried, and living in a society that judged women like her by strict standards of respectability. We know her today mainly through the circumstances of her death and the courtroom arguments that followed. That can make her seem like a figure in somebody else's story, but before any suspect, any trial, or any disputed evidence, there was Rose herself standing at the center of a life that was about to be violently taken from her. On the night of May the 31st, the weather deteriorated. The storm became severe, bringing heavy rain, strong wind, thunder, and flashes of lightning. It was the sort of night that muffled ordinary sounds and made movement outdoors difficult to observe. Footsteps could be washed away. A door opening might be lost beneath the thunder, if someone wanted to cross the village unnoticed. The storm offered cover. It also meant that later attempts to reconstruct the night would be uncertain from the very beginning. The following morning, Rose's father entered Providence House and found her lying at the bottom of the staircase. There was no realistic hope of helping her. Rose had suffered wounds to her throat and chest, injuries serious enough to show that this was not a fall or an accident. The position of her body immediately raised questions. Had she been attacked on the stairs? Had she tried to escape, or had her body been moved after the assault? The room could not answer clearly. Then there were the burns. Parts of Rose's clothing had been scorched, and a broken bottle associated with paraffin was discovered nearby. Investigators believe someone may have tried to start a fire, possibly to destroy the body, damage evidence, or make the death look accidental. But whatever had been intended, it had failed. The flames did not consume Providence House. Instead, they left behind another layer of evidence, one that seemed important but never produced a single, certain explanation. Now here's where the case becomes even more troubling. An examination established that Rose was pregnant. For investigators in 1902, that discovery immediately suggested a possible motive. They began asking who the father might have been and whether Rose's pregnancy had created fear, shame, or the threat of public exposure. But pregnancy alone did not identify her killer. It only widened the field of suspicion while placing Rose's private life under intense and often unforgiving scrutiny. There was also a note. Rose had received an unsigned message arranging a secret meeting at or near midnight. That detail appeared to provide a direct path into the final hours of her life. Someone apparently expected Rose to be awake and available while the village slept. Someone may have known that the storm would make the meeting easier to conceal. Yet the note contained no signature, and the absence of a name would become one of the most important problems in the entire investigation. So let's back up a second and consider what that note meant. If Rose trusted the writer, she may have gone to the meeting willingly. If she recognized the handwriting, a signature would not have been necessary. But it is also possible the writer copied or disguised another person's hand. The note could have been sincere, deceptive, or even planted to redirect suspicion. Investigators treated it as a crucial clue, but a clue is not the same thing as proof, especially when its author cannot be established with certainty. The likely timeline placed the killing around midnight at the height of the storm. Rose was inside Providence House, apparently expecting someone. There were no reliable eyewitnesses to the attack. No one could describe an intruder arriving, and no one could say they had watched the killer leave. The weather that made the night so memorable also made observation almost impossible. Later, people would recall sounds, movements, and impressions, but those memories had to compete with darkness, distance, rain, and thunder. Investigators focused on William Gardiner, a local carpenter who also held a position of responsibility within the church community. Gardiner was not a stranger passing through Peacenhall. He was known in the village, and so was Rose. Their connection through local religious life gave police a reason to examine whether they had known each other more closely than either reputation suggested. Soon, the inquiry moved beyond general questions and toward the possibility that Gardiner had arranged the midnight meeting himself. Reports and testimony surrounding the case suggested there had been gossip about Rose and Gardiner before the murder. Their relationship became the subject of suspicion within the community, particularly once Rose's pregnancy was discovered. The prosecution would later use that background to suggest motive. Gardner, however, denied killing Rose and denied writing the unsigned note. The existence of gossip could make the state's theory sound plausible, but gossip was also dangerous evidence. Repetition can make a rumor feel established without ever proving it true. Police arrested Gardner after circumstantial evidence appeared to connect him, or at least his household, to objects found at Providence house. The paraffin bottle and other details from the scene were examined for links to his home. Investigators also considered the note, the timing of the storm, his possible opportunity to leave unnoticed, and the alleged relationship with Rose. Taken together, these details formed a narrative. The central question was whether that narrative demonstrated guilt or merely assembled suspicion around the most obvious local suspect. The household connections mattered because the prosecution needed to explain how the suspected killer had arrived prepared. Paraffin was not unusual in a period when it was commonly used for lighting and household purposes. A bottle could therefore seem both ordinary and highly significant, depending on whether it could be traced to a particular source. Similar objects were compared and witnesses were asked what belonged where, but an item resembling something from one household did not automatically prove who carried it to the scene. Handwriting became another contested part of the case. If the unsigned meeting note could be attributed to Gardner, it would place him much closer to Rose's final movements. Samples were studied and opinions offered, yet handwriting comparison at the time was far from infallible. Even trained observers could disagree, especially if a writer had deliberately altered the shape or rhythm of the letters. Gardner continued to deny authorship, leaving jurors to decide how much confidence they could place in interpretation rather than direct identification. There was no confession. There was no witness who had seen Gardner attack Rose, and there was no simple piece of physical evidence that placed a weapon in his hand at the crucial moment. Instead, the case depended on accumulation, the alleged relationship, the pregnancy, the note, the storm, the opportunity, and household items that the prosecution believed connected him to Providence house. Circumstantial cases can be powerful, but only when the individual circumstances fit together without leaving a reasonable alternative. The condition of the scene created problems as well. Providence house was not preserved according to modern forensic standards because those standards did not yet exist. People entered, objects were handled, and the significance of tiny traces was not always understood. Fingerprint evidence was still in its early practical use, and there was no genetic testing. Blood, fibers, soil, and biological material could not be analyzed with anything close to today's precision. Once those opportunities were lost, they could never be recovered. Even determining the sequence of events was difficult. Rose had wounds to both her throat and chest, but which came first? Was the attempted fire part of the original plan or a panicked decision after the attack? Did the bottle break accidentally during a struggle, or was it smashed deliberately? Did Rose know she was in danger when she approached the stairs? Each answer could change the picture of the killer, from someone acting with preparation to someone reacting suddenly when a confrontation went wrong. Investigators also had to ask whether the note and the murder were unquestionably connected. It seems logical that they were, because both point toward a midnight encounter. But what if the writer never appeared? What if someone else learned about the meeting and used it as an opportunity? Or what if Rose's death resulted from a confrontation unrelated to the message? These possibilities may feel less direct, but a proper investigation has to test them. Otherwise, a compelling theory can harden into tunnel vision. The community atmosphere made neutrality especially difficult. Peacenhall was not watching an anonymous case unfold in a distant city. The victim, suspect, witnesses, and families belonged to the same local world. People attended the same places, heard the same rumors, and understood the social consequences of pregnancy outside marriage. By the time Gardner came to trial, jurors were not simply hearing about a violent death. They were being asked to sort fact from reputation and physical evidence from moral judgment. Gardner's first murder trial began in November of 1902. The prosecution presented the case as a connected chain of circumstances. Rose had received a secret note. She was pregnant. Gardner was said to have had a relationship with her. Items at the scene appeared linked to his household, and the storm provided cover for movement during the night. In the prosecution's telling, these were not isolated coincidences. They were parts of one deliberate effort to silence Rose and conceal the crime. The defense attacked the spaces between those parts. Suspicion about a relationship did not prove murder. Pregnancy did not establish paternity. Similar household objects did not show who had carried them. A disputed handwriting comparison did not conclusively identify the note's author, and the absence of an eyewitness mattered. Gardner maintained his innocence. His lawyers did not have to prove who else killed Rose. Their task was to show that the prosecution had not eliminated reasonable doubt about whether Gardner did. Think about the position of the jurors. They had a young woman killed after an apparent midnight appointment and a local man surrounded by damaging circumstances. Yet they also had no direct view of the crime. Every important step required an inference. If Gardner wrote the note, if he was the father of Rose's child, if the paraffin came from his household, and if he left home during the storm, the case looked strong. But uncertainty about any one link weakened all the others. After hearing the evidence, the first jury could not reach a verdict. That failure did not amount to an acquittal, but it did reveal a deep division. Some jurors evidently believed the circumstantial case pointed toward guilt. Others were not prepared to convict a man of murder without firmer proof. In a case carrying the gravest possible consequences, agreement was essential. Since agreement could not be reached, the proceedings ended without a final decision, and Gardner remained under suspicion while prosecutors prepared to try again. A second trial followed in January of 1903. Much of the same evidence returned, but repetition did not remove its ambiguities. The note was still unsigned. The alleged motive remained dependent on claims about Rose and Gardner's relationship. The objects from the scene still required interpretation, and the storm still obscured the actual movements of whoever entered Providence House that night. Once again, the prosecution asked jurors to see a single coherent story. Once again, the defense pointed to unanswered questions. The second jury also failed to reach a verdict. Two separate groups had now heard the accusation, the evidence, and Gardner's denials, yet neither could agree unanimously on guilt or innocence. That is an unusual and revealing outcome. It does not tell us that the case against him was empty, nor does it prove that he was responsible. It tells us the evidence was persuasive enough to prosecute, but uncertain enough that at least some jurors could not cross the line required for conviction. After the second unresolved trial, Gardner was released. He had not been acquitted by a verdict declaring him not guilty, but neither had the state proved the charge against him. Legally, the case had reached an impasse. Public suspicion, however, does not always follow legal rules. For some, Gardner remained the obvious killer who had escaped conviction. For others, he was a man nearly condemned by rumor and coincidence. Neither view could supply what the trials had failed to produce, a definitive answer. And Rose was left behind in all of this. Courtroom debate turned her pregnancy into motive, her associations into evidence, and her final hours into competing theories. We should be careful not to reduce her to those details. She was 22 years old, working as a domestic servant, and living under social pressures that gave her limited control over how others described her. Whatever private choices she made, none of them explain away the violence committed against her or lessen the responsibility of the person who killed her. More than a century later, the unanswered questions remain remarkably clear. Who wrote the midnight note? Was the writer the same person who attacked Rose? Who was the father of her unborn child? Why were her clothes burned? Was the attempted fire meant to erase evidence, disguise the cause of death, or destroy Providence House itself? And were the objects linked to Gardner's household genuinely incriminating, or did investigators assign too much meaning to common items because they already suspected him? The storm is almost a character in the story, though it cannot answer any of those questions. It concealed movement, drowned out sound, disturbed possible tracks, and gave the killer darkness in which to disappear. By morning, the rain had passed over Peacenhall, but the uncertainty remained. Rose Harsent's murder is still officially unsolved. The two trials preserved the evidence and arguments, yet they also preserved doubt. Somewhere between the unsigned note and the failed fire, the truth of midnight at Providence House was lost. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.